just got up, and as you can see, it was extremely windy. Everything is covered in sand.
It had been a long night, with the fierce winds howling outside my tent as I drifted in and out of light sleep, attempting to gain some respite from the endless sound of the wind and sand battering my tent like an endless rain of tiny hailstones. The tent fluttered and buzzed almost constantly in the wind. I slept in until sunrise, knowing that there was no way I could create images in that wind with a large format camera. Walking alone would have been difficult, and photography of any kind harder still. Blowing sand soared above the ground to about knee-deep in the flat areas, with plumes of sand soaring 20 to 30 feet above the tops of the high dunes, like the spray of a desert surf. Eventually, I emerged from my tent and decided to attempt an exposure. I scouted the areas around the edges of the dunes and contemplated venturing in to see if there were any good compositions there, even though I couldn't make anything out of it. I settled on a composition on the outskirt of the dune field with the rise of a small dune framing up distant mountains in the background, and set up my camera. I had to hold down the tripod with one hand while attempting to focus and compose with the other. While reaching into my bag to grab a film holder, the wind grabbed my camera and tripod right off the ground, slamming them over, face first, into the sand. The Intrepid cameras are incredibly resilient, one of the many reasons I use them, and the camera suffered no damage whatsoever. This is actually the second time this has happened to me. You'd think I'd learn. Despite immense difficulty, I was able to make 2 successful exposures before packing up and deciding to head back to my truck, up over Town Pass and into Death Valley.
It is incredibly beautiful out here, but the wind, I don't know if you can tell, it's probably really loud, but we're looking at, I don't know, down here 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts. Up there on the crests, I'm going to guess that that's probably about, I don't know, 40 or 50 mile an hour wind. There's like no chance I'm going to be able to shoot an 8x10 up there. It's just going to blow like a sail and just go tumbling down the dune. And I remember when I shot my Mojave monochrome series, I used a Mamiya RB67, which is like a tank. That's a black and white film photography project that I did, documenting the dunes of the Mojave Desert, and that's part of what this is about today. I was trying to expand it into 8x10, but it's a lot harder to shoot 8x10 on these sand dunes than to shoot medium format, because the medium format camera is like a little tank. It's really dense, it's really heavy, it doesn't blow around in the wind. Maybe I should have brought one of those. So this is the inside of my tent. Tent site, and I'm heading back to the truck.
After packing up my campsite, leaving no trace of my presence, I began the 4-mile hike across the open desert back to my truck. Fortunately, the return hike was all downhill, and I was able to make it quickly. As I hiked across the desert, a military fighter jet made a low pass overhead, performing aerobatic maneuvers in training for combat. This was the first of 2 times this happened on the trip, and tends to be one of the many unusual things I experience on my trips to Death Valley. After hiking for about an hour and a half, I finally arrived back at my truck, packed away my gear, and headed back to the paved road.
Well, I just made it back to the truck after shooting the Panamint Dunes, and I'm going to head over to Panamint Springs and try and get some fuel, play it by ear, and then see how that goes, and then I'll
probably try and drive up over the pass into Death Valley after that. It was a rough night, insane wind. I probably had 5 pounds of sand in my tent in the morning, all over everything. I think I would recommend it and do it again. It's just I probably wouldn't do it with 8x10 because maybe not even 4x5. I think it's really a medium format type deal or 35 millimeter, because the wind is just so insane that it just makes it virtually impossible to shoot large format out there, at least when I was there. But definitely worth shooting. Incredibly beautiful place, incredibly great conditions, and exciting times in Death Valley. After leaving the dunes, I made the bumpy 6-mile drive back down the Jeep trail to the paved road, followed by the steep, winding drive up and over Town Pass and into Death Valley. I drove to the Furnace Creek Campground and reserved a site for the night before making plans for the day. I knew a slot canyon was my only hope of evading the wind. I also decided to shoot the 4x5 camera so I could shoot color, as my color 8x10 film had been delayed in a shipment from Fuji, Japan and failed to arrive in time for the trip. I decided to spend the day in Sidewinder Canyon, an area I'd explored years ago and had been wanting to revisit with large format film.
So after I moved my camp to Furnace Creek, I decided to come out here to Sidewinder Canyon in hopes of evading some of the tourists. However, that didn't work. Look at this. So basically, last time I came here, I was the only person here pretty much for an entire day, and now this place is a zoo. Same thing, a lot of other places I went to, driving down here, I passed by Golden Canyon, and the parking lot was completely jammed full, and there was cars lined up on both sides of the road for a long ways. Badwater was the exact same thing. It just shows that, because of social media, that the national parks have just become really overloaded with people. Because previously at this time of year, you could come out here and it would be practically empty at those locations. Well, maybe not Badwater, but like Sidewinder, like previously no one had ever heard of it, and it was really unknown. So anyway, I guess on the plus side, I won't have to worry about being totally alone if anything happens, so that's always nice. But hopefully I can get some photos without too many people in them. So yeah, we'll see. Alright, better get hiking. The reason I came here was because the wind is actually prohibitive of shooting large format pretty much everywhere open in the park. So if I come up in these slot canyons, they're super narrow and long and deep, and I'm hoping that that'll just completely block out all the wind, and that'll do the trick.
When you think of Death Valley, you probably think of wide open vistas stretching on for hundreds of miles in every direction, but Death Valley also has some incredibly tight spaces as well. Slot canyons are something you might associate with Utah or Arizona, but California has hundreds of them, and some of my favorites are located right here in Death Valley. Unlike the smooth red sandstone canyons of the Colorado Plateau, the canyons here are made of some strange materials. Brown and gray mudstone conglomerate tends to dominate the southern canyons, like you see here, while blue and white marble tends to dominate those farther north. Death Valley never ceases to amaze with the unusual geology and endless variety it holds, and slot canyons are one of my favorite photographic subjects. Often, the color palettes you see in slot canyons are caused more by reflected light than by the stone itself. Sunlight loses part of its spectrum each time it's reflected, starting out golden at the top of the canyon and becoming bluish at the bottom. This effect is amplified by the reflection of the blue sky and the neutral colored sand on the ground.
So as you can see, it's pretty amazing, and there's no wind. So I've just been here photographing these incredible light in these slot canyons here, and I found some nice reflected light up in this section above me, and exposed one frame of portrait on this composition, and a frame of Velvia and a frame of portrait on a composition over there. So 3 frames so far in here. I like the colors of the Velvia, but Portrait 400 has incredible dynamic range, and it allows me to get much faster shutter times in these dark slot canyons, especially this one because it's very dark. And the dynamic range cannot be overstated. It's extremely great dynamic range. So I'm really thinking I exposed for the shadows, and I really think it's gonna make a nice image on the portrait.
Dynamic range is a term that refers to the ability of a film or sensor to maintain adequate detail in both the darkest shadows and brightest highlights. The farther apart these two values are, the greater the dynamic range. The closer together they are, the less the dynamic range. Slot canyons are notorious for having extremely wide dynamic range, as the top of the canyon tends to be radically brighter than the bottom, and capturing the shifts from the warm light at the top of the canyon to the cool light at the bottom is one of the things that makes slot canyon images appealing and special. Usually landscape photographers prefer to use slide film to capture scenes like this due to its saturated colors and high contrast. However, I often find that in scenes like this one, slide film comes out too dark and is often unable to hold detail in both the shadows and the highlights. That was the case here, and my slide film exposures came out virtually unusable. However, my exposures on the color negative film, Portra 400, came out beautifully.
I only explored one of the 3 slot canyons in Sidewinder on this trip. I've spent a bunch of time here before, so I wasn't too worried about it. It's kind of the point. Basically, I decided to just focus my time on this one canyon and try and make as many exposures as I could. So I ended up shooting 5 exposures of 4x5 film. A mixture of Velvia and Portra 400, and yeah, so hopefully I hedged my bets well enough by doing that, and we get a good variety of images. So each image should be represented in 2 very different styles, and I think that should be good to have some variety to work from. So.
On day 2 of the trip, I shot 4x5 exclusively, as I knew I wanted color images and I only had black and white film with me for the 8x10. Color film, especially slide film in 8x10, is incredibly expensive and can also be very hard to come by. I had an order in from Japan, which hadn't showed up in time for this trip. Buying imported Velvia in the US is about $450 for a box of 20 exposures. As I made my way out of the canyon, I knew I had made a good collection of images and was happy with the work I'd been able to create. I was startled to find that all of the other people had left, leaving me completely alone by the time I finished my hike. I got back in my truck and drove up Badwater Basin to the badlands of 20 Mule Team Canyon to do something I'd had in mind for a long time: photographing badlands at blue hour on Kodak Portra 400. This combination results in gorgeous pastel tones with surreal shapes and textures. Once the light was gone, I headed back down to camp in Furnace Creek for a restful night sheltered from the wind, camping in my truck. It had been a productive day, and I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the lack of sleep the night before.
The light is just about gone, but I just made 2 exposures on the scene behind me, on one on Velvia and one on Portra, typical theme of today. And I just think that scene is going to be spectacular. Just the beautiful pastel tones, the sort of a midnight blue color, the warm tones in the rocks. And it's so dark right now, but I love the softness of this light and just the nuance of the tones. Anyway, I'm going to pack it in because I think it's about dark, and I need to get back to camp, and hopefully nobody stole my sight.
All told, day 2 of my Death Valley 2018 trip had been a success. I was able to make a variety of new images that I'm happy with, from the dune image in the morning when my camera blew over, to the slot canyon images of Sidewinder Canyon, and finally capturing the blue hour pastels in the badlands of 20 Mule Team Canyon. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share to help support this new channel. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.